Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where two mental health professionals talk about their mental health journey and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist. To support the show, head over to patreon.com/wellnesswithjer. We've got merch, we've got other cool stuff, the podcast. Likes and subscribes are also appreciated. Super stoked to be back today with the podcast. A therapist who I'm very excited to talk about and learn from and learn with. Today, I am joined by Patrice Flanagan-Morris, the owner and operator at Empowerment Within. Patrice, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
I always start with the same question, which is, how did you get into the mental health field?
I grew up with a lot of my own challenges around anxiety and depression, and remember therapy being introduced to me as a teenager and being very insistent that it was terrible and highly stigmatized in the community that I was in because it was very conservative. And so as I started going through my undergraduate program, I just started seeing how impactful having somebody to talk to and work with to challenge your perspectives and ideas about life could really shift your mindset and how you really find joy in life. And so after I worked at the suicide hotline for a couple of years, I decided to go back to into my master's program to become a licensed clinical social worker and start to pivot in working in therapy settings, especially with my primary population I worked with at first was adolescents, and then involuntary adolescents, because I just love a challenge. And connecting with teens is really fun, even if it's sometimes hurtful in the process. And just through all of that, all of my own personal struggles and then getting to support people who just really needed to be seen and heard really has felt like such a giving profession for me.
Yeah. Yeah. So what was your journey then? You talk about doing some stuff in undergrad. Like, were you a psych major? Were you like, I had a therapist, now I'm going to go be a therapist? Was that kind of the route, or was it more kind of weaving to land where you are now?
Yeah, I moved to Madison, and just the change in culture and openness that I found there really, I didn't ever attend therapy in undergrad. I think I went a couple of times with like the free counselors that they had there, but I wasn't
Sure.
super invested and I was still pretty held back from the process. But all the ways in which I ended up challenging myself in going through school and then recognizing just how anxious I was and that other people weren't as anxious as me was kind of a wake up call to be like, oh, I guess this isn't the way you have to live life all the time. Because I came from a very anxious family. So it was just very normal. So I think that
Yeah.
shift into going to college, living on my own, being in a city that was a lot more open minded really helped me then make the pivot towards moving towards graduate school. And that's when I actually first started attending therapy regularly.
Sure. Fun. Um, I went to therapy for the first time in grad school as well. It's when I got my ADHD diagnosis, my last year of my post grad, which is, I like to joke, like the worst time to get a diagnosis. Thanks. Now I'm done.
Now I'm done
Um,
with school and don't need any of the assistance that I could have
yeah,
gotten.
could have gotten a lot more accommodations than I did. Uh, Curious about your grad school experience, as I know you are now owner of a practice. Like, what preparation did you have for not just the work you do now and the clients you work with, but also like the business side of things? Was that a thing that was promoted or talked about, or was it just kind of like grad school to internship to agency pipeline of under or of post grad?
Yeah, I mean, in getting your master's in social work, the idea is that you're basically going to live to work for the rest of your life in order to serve an underserved population. And I think I love social work with the idea that it really involves a lot of systems and understanding external and internal impacts on what gets people where they are. But most of the teaching that I received was relatively generalized and very brief support rather than long-term kind of healing for people, and even long-term healing of the systems that exist in place that are causing a lot of the issues. Um, I will say that I did a trauma-informed certification route in my master's program, and that was really helpful for me because I connected with a teacher that I took multiple classes with where I really felt like I got hands-on experience and understanding of how trauma works in the brain and the body, and used that as my platform to kind of bounce off of, which really helped me from the very start of my practice, just having a very different understanding of what's actually neurobiologically going on with people.
Yeah, for sure. Um, so what was then the journey to owning your own practice and getting into
Oh
the
my
business
gosh.
side of it?
Yeah, so in my graduate program, the teacher that I was talking about introduced me to brain spotting, and that is what I did. I completed my phase one and my phase two before I graduated undergrad, and so it was my primary modality to use. And in going through the trainings and then seeking out my own brain spotting therapy, it just transformed me so much as a human being. I tell everybody like I'm a recovering perfectionist and it still comes out in some moments. But prior to brain spotting, part of what fueled so much of my anxiety was this high rigidity and black and white and right and wrong.
Mhm.
And as I went through brain spotting, my own therapy in brain spotting, so much of that just kind of got broken down into understanding the different parts of myself that were holding on to that and why they were holding on to it. And so much of my anxiety got relieved in that process that really helped me kind of grow into where I went after grad school. So I started at a nonprofit residential teen center, and then I was also in tandem working at a private practice part-time until I got all my hours. And then I decided to, it was really challenging in the residential facility because I loved getting to be there with all the girls. And I think it just creates such a different relationship to get to sit down and have lunch together. And I'd come in early if they wanted to exercise and we'd do like a little program together. It really helped build the therapeutic relationship to do some of the deep work. But unfortunately, the company itself really struggled with having trauma informed practices. And I
Sure.
had to hit a point where I had to decide like, do I continue to participate in a company that is unwilling to shift and is actively traumatizing the kids I'm trying to help heal trauma? Or do I try to make a shift and go somewhere else, and see if I can make a difference? And so after that point, I shifted to a group practice for a while. And just recognized that I would be okay on my own and that I could do things a little bit more in the way that I was aligned to do them. I really believe in supporting people as holistically as possible, helping understand the whole picture, doing that deep rooted healing. And so I just wanted to start a company that kind of represented that instead of being with other companies that had different missions and values and maybe at times weren't always very congruent with those missions and values. I wanted to start my own thing where I could keep myself in checks and balances of being very congruent in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so many pieces to pull apart there. I love the word congruent. It's one that I use in therapy a lot with my clients, but also experienced um, that similar journey of like being in different agencies, working in different private practices and seeing how other people did it. And like for me, it was seeing other people do it poorly that finally gave me the confidence to be like, oh, I could do that.
Yeah,
I didn't know that I could do it if I could do it well, but like, there were things where it's like, at least I won't be doing that. At least I can
yeah.
practice from an ethical or an aligned perspective instead of a money making perspective or a re traumatizing perspective, kind of like you were mentioning.
Mhm.
Uh, a lot of my listeners are therapists, but for the people who are not, can you explain brain spotting? I know it's been around for a long time. I'm familiar with it, but for a listener who maybe has never heard of it before or is less familiar with what that looks like, can you do a brief Cliff Notes
Brief,
overview of
brief,
brain
Patrice.
of brain spotting?
I could tell you, I could talk about brain spotting for hours. I have. So I tell people in the simplest manner, brain spotting is a bottom up therapy that supports in bridging the gap from what you know to what you feel. So, a lot of us walk around the world knowing we should take better care of ourselves, knowing we should quit our jobs, knowing we should leave a relationship, but really struggling with the feeling of like wanting to stay and keep trying. And so, what brain spotting does is supports us in going into those felt senses and those feelings to reorganize the brain so we get to act in our present moment with what is best for us in the present day rather than what our wounding or conditioning from our past is telling us to do.
That was lovely. Um, should we start beef with EMDR providers? Um, I was I was introduced. I'm powering through here. I was introduced to brain spotting through a professor who referred to it as the redheaded stepchild of EMDR, which I think is offensive on a lot of terms.
Yeah.
Um, but it is a different experience, and I think EMDR is one of those ones that I'm not trained in it. I don't do it, but a lot of my clients who have experienced, you either kind of love it or hate it.
Mhm.
And I find brain spotting, anecdotally, has been a softer sort of launching point for that brain body connection work and that bottom up that therapy that you're talking about. Is that, as someone who does brain spotting, is that something that comes up? Is that something that you hear from people who have maybe tried EMDR before and are hesitant about brain spotting?
Yeah, I have quite a few clients who have done EMDR in the past and found it to be either too organized and planned almost for what like a subcortical brain can handle because so much of the information we store down there just like doesn't make a lot of sense. I tell people it's like if you give a 4-year-old a bunch of different colored papers and colored folders, your expectation isn't going to be that they get it 100% accurate. And that's kind of how our subcortical brain is too. So I've had a lot of people who either experience it as too structured and rigid or who experience it as relatively traumatizing if something opens up too fast and is hard to contain. And
Hmm.
so the reason I really love brain spotting is there is such a emphasis on that relational attunement with your client and there's so many ways that we can ebb and flow in and out of things and only need to stay there for a little bit that people can pendulate in and out of the pain points without needing to stay too long if that's what they need in order to start moving through what they need to move through. So there's just so much flexibility with it to meet clients where they're at and attend to what they're needing in the here and now.
Yeah, and I think that sounds like it aligns with what you're talking about, holistic treatment, in that having a modality that is a little more flexible. And to be fair to EMDR and a lot of lovely providers who do it, like, a skilled provider can be flexible with
Yes.
EMDR. It does not need to be rigid. It does not need to be overwhelming. But I've heard from a lot of clients with that feedback that it just is, whether that's how the provider does it or that's how they're taught or whatever. And so I think that holistic care, especially for a community that's coming from um, trauma, complex
Mhm.
trauma, being able to have flexibility is really important and provide some autonomy for that client to work through their own healing.
Yeah, and a lot of what we struggle with on a day-to-day basis is implicit or unknown, unseen, like not understood by us. And when we don't have like targets or memories or specific things we can pull on, we just have this felt sense, you know, that's where brain spotting really can do some deep and meaningful work because it's not even that you'll get the whole picture, but you can start moving stuff through that you don't even know what it is. We have kind of a saying that we say, like, you don't have to know what it is to know that it is and to be able
Hmm.
to process it. And for a lot of people, it's those implicit callings and senses that push them into making decisions that maybe just aren't aligned for them or they didn't want to make and they just end up doing it anyways.
Yeah. Yeah. I am 100% going to steal that. We don't always need to know what it is, or we don't always know why it is to know that it is. Like,
Yeah.
I think a lot of times I say to clients, like, that's a rabbit hole we can go down. I don't know what it will change. If that feels meaningful to you, let's do that. But
Mhm.
um, because again, I think that's people's idea of therapy often is this still sort of Freudian, let's go back to childhood. It's like we
Mhm.
can, we don't we might not need to. We might,
Mhm.
but we might not. And deciding, and again, providing that opportunity for clients to weigh in if that's something they want to do or not.
Yeah.
Um, so that was transformative for you,
Mhm.
and then bringing that into your work. Um, I know your website has DBT and all these other modalities. How do you, as a therapist, sort of decide? Because I'm guessing most clients don't call in and say, "Hey, I have complex trauma. Can we do brain spotting?" Although there are clients who are far more informed now than when I started doing therapy.
Yeah.
But how do you kind of introduce it to clients? How do you kind of bridge the modalities that you're bringing to build kind of this holistic treatment for someone?
Yeah, I try to support clients in an intake to see, what their long-term goals are and what they might need before they do deep subcortical processing. Subcortical processing is just like, I guess, another phrase of really looking at ourselves honestly and seeing ourselves honestly. And so sometimes we don't have the regulation tools, we don't have the calming effect, we don't have the emotional discernment to be able to look at that, because sometimes when we look in the mirror, it's like, ooh, I know when I first did brain spotting, I was like, but I didn't really think I was perfect, but I thought I was right a lot of the time. And it
Hmm.
turned out that like that was a part of my defense mechanisms. And I was actually, maybe stepping on people or being too brutally honest instead of compassionately honest. And because I could guise it under my value system, that it was fine. And sometimes looking at ourselves, we see the pain points, but we also see the pain points that we've caused for other people. And if we don't have the skills to deal with that in a non-shame based way, it can be really disorienting and unraveling. And so that's kind of how I gauge for people of like, maybe we need to start with some nervous system regulation, we need to start with some reflection work, some emotional discernment work. Maybe you need some DBT skills to be able to start challenging your perspective in the here and now before we can move into this modality that's really gonna send you into a time warp, and we just don't know. Like embracing uncertainty, I have no idea what's going to come out of it.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, I joke with a lot of clients, like some of the things that the stereotypes of therapy. Marriage therapist says plan a date night. A therapist recommends going to yoga, or journaling. Those things are all valid and good and don't fix anything
Right.
in and of themselves. And so I think it's one of those things with like DBT when I'm introducing it to clients, because I use DBT a lot. It's kind of like, this is all really good for you. Let's try and find two or three things that feel natural and resonate, and
Mhm.
like, let's practice them as a skill-based thing. And I find people really like that, and that tends to be a good practice for them. I'm a sports background person, so that aligns with kind of how I do therapy. And then we can move into the philosophy, because I'm aware, as kind of a guy who looks like a hippie, if I lead with radical acceptance, if I lead with some of the philosophy of DBT, it feels far less approachable for clients than if we start with the skill-based stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if you've never had the lived experience of any of those philosophies, then they can seem either really toxically positive
Hmm.
or just so unattainable that it almost starts its own shame response. And it's like, yeah, I want to live like that, but I have no idea what a lived experience of that would be, that I can't even like get close to it. So I love that. It's helping clients get to a space where they can kind of see some of that stuff themselves, that then they can move in that direction almost on their own.
Yeah. This shame response you've mentioned a couple of times. Let's
Yeah.
underline that and talk about it. I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up with a parent who had anxiety, undiagnosed and untreated. I also grew up super conservative Christian. So that shame response is something deeply ingrained in my lived experience. But I think any of those components, whether it's culturally Midwest, whether it's high control religion,
Mhm.
growing up with a parent who has perhaps untreated or undiagnosed mental health condition, like, there is a shame response that a lot of us get no choice in the matter. We're kind of
Mhm.
shown that's what you do. Um, as even laughing, just I traveled for a conference this past weekend, and like some of the cultural norms in the Midwest are like to be quiet and to not bother people. And so like
Mhm.
what's your experience as a provider working with some people, the shame response? Where are they coming from with that shame response, and how do you sort of introduce that topic to them if they're not aware that that's really what's going on?
Yeah, shame and self-compassion are really big in my practice in general, and I don't follow traditional self-compassion tactics because I find a lot of people, at least initially, have a really hard time connecting into them. Um, but when I talk about shame responses to people, there's a lot of places that it can come from. I think with having such a big emphasis on trauma right now, that's what everybody's looking at. And trauma is real and it exists, and there's small t's and big t's, but our simple conditioning societally through our school systems, through our family of origin, through what our expectations to be a man or a woman, and what does it mean to not fall in those categories, all cause underlying shame responses to know who you're supposed to be. And if you don't fit that, which the update is almost no one, I've never met anybody that fits like the societal standard of what a person is. It's wild to me that it even exists. So if you don't fit that, or the ways that you don't fit that, is something that you need to learn how to hide and mask, because it is either going to cause other people to be uncomfortable, or you're going to kind of get found out. I think that's like
Mhm.
what a huge shame response is we don't want to get found out that we're too much, or that we take up too much space. And so we just kind of find a way to like contain and maybe find some people that we can share some parts of ourselves with. And then we just navigate these like darker sides of ourselves on our own.
Mhm. Yeah. And how do you introduce that to a client who you're maybe seeing it pop up regularly? It's a theme, it's probably a thing to work on, but maybe they're not aware that it's shame based.
Yeah, I'm a pretty direct and honest person in my sessions. I think the clients that do the best with me are the clients that are wanting that. And I have found, like I said, ways to, I used to be a very brutally honest person, and I have found that for some reason that just doesn't work. Turns out it never worked for me, and it doesn't work for other people. And so I found very compassionate ways to, when I'm noticing it, I just bring it to the table and I say, hey, this is, I'm seeing this pop up now multiple times, and it looks like, you're you're feeling a little bit shameful about a part of yourself, and you're almost trying to let me in certain avenues, but you're not fully wanting to go there because you're kind of afraid of my response. Can you tell me more about that? And some
Yeah.
people consciously know it, and then some people subconsciously then have an opportunity to bring awareness to it, to start recognizing it in their day-to-day life and in our sessions.
Yeah. One of my specialties is religious trauma. So shame again is built into the it's a built-in component for a lot of people raised Lutheran, raised Catholic, like even joking about like Catholic guilt as if it were
Mhm.
some sort of good thing. Um, and shame is just one of those really provocative words I find. And so finding ways to talk about it with clients and frame it in a way that makes sense to them, because even sometimes bringing up shame elicits a shame response.
Yeah.
And so that's just it's this cyclical thing, that kind of finding that way to bring some awareness to it and gently pull it out and say, hey, this is a thing we can look at, thing we can talk about. Again, why I love DBT, because it sets it up as a way to sort of tolerate some of that distress as you're working through that shame response.
Yeah, I think it, even those conversations then give you a good clinical impression or idea of what clients might need in order to move in that direction more if they're really struggling to do it. And I try to explain most of what I talk about with clients from a very like brain and body based nervous system kind of idea, to decharacterize it as much as possible, instead of this like almost being like who you are as a person. It's just like, oh, that's the way that your nervous system has adapted to things, like
Yeah.
that this is the physiological experience of shame and the psychological consequences of it, and then how do we kind of deal with that, and work with that when it's coming up, rather than it being something characteristically wrong with me in how I'm shutting down or perceiving or experiencing the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And that sounds very nice and succinct, but can be a very elaborate, messy process.
It is. I get feedback a lot that my statements sound very succinct, and I always remind people I know I make it sound easy and simple, and like the thing about human beings is they are not easy and simple. Like the process of doing all of that is complicated and very individualized because everybody's brain is formed differently and has different stuff stored for different reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. I frame that as humans in general are incredibly predictable and follow very easy patterns. Single individuals are very complex and almost impossible to predict.
That's true.
Um, so it's easy to see some of these patterns and note some of these things and know that they're unhealthy or unsustainable. And yet, kind of creating a plan for what that looks like to do something healthier is so variable that doing it on a case by case basis is really what makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge sometimes that I even have with like social media and stuff like that because, I try to post stuff and I've had a really hard time figuring out ways to present information to a general public that's really meant for an individual
Yeah,
because it you can read something and understand it, and the way that you go about doing that thing is going to have to be so different than the person next to you. And I think
mhm,
that in and of itself, causes a shame response. People have the most access to self-healing and self-help that they've ever had, and it almost is causing more anxiety and overwhelm because we like know what we're supposed to do, but we can't, and it's not working for us the way that it worked for this person. And I
yeah.
really think that's where individual therapy comes into play because it needs to be about you as an individual. It's great you're gathering information. Now, what do we do with it?
Correct. Yeah. And so much of social media is clips for engagement and it's
Mhm.
short and succinct. You think about how long the average TikTok is. That doesn't allow for nuance. And so, my ADHDers that I work with a lot, well, I saw a reel that says wear shoes in the house and that helps your ADHD. And it's like, yeah, if that works for you,
Yeah,
absolutely do it. And if it doesn't, like that just worked for that person. And I think a lot of influencers are posting based on personal experience without necessarily that depth of knowledge from being a provider or engaging with other people's experiences that
yeah,
allows them to say, hey, there's some nuance here. It's easy to say, wear shoes and that cures your ADHD. And as a therapist, I'd be like, oh, absolutely not, even if it helps some people.
right.
Um, Yeah, I have an episode coming up soon just on social media. So I don't want to deep dive too much, but it is interesting peek behind the curtain for us therapists who are also online and business owners, and you have to promote, you have to have
Yeah.
online presence as a business owner in 2024. And so how do you kind of navigate some of that? How do you find a balance between being real and authentic and playing the algorithm game and some of those other things?
Yeah, I mean, that's been really tough for me as a business owner. I first started going online more when I had employees to just kind of start creating my own brand, I guess. Even saying that like doesn't feel the best, but it is a brand to me. It's hopefully represents who I am mostly as a person. Um, and I initially started with trying to figure out how to like play the game and the algorithm, but stay aligned with my values. And I just found that with time that was so taxing on me and caused so much anxiousness and overwhelm that I just took a step back and I was like, if I'm causing, and I think about this with individual clients too, if I'm a drop of water that's causing a ripple for somebody, that's all that's really important to me at the end of the day, and so I really try not to, um, play too much of the game anymore, and I try to, like, post weekly to be consistent and share stuff that I find to be interesting, and then just try to stay true and consistent to what my messaging is, and sometimes that means it goes really far, and other times it means it doesn't go far at all.
Yeah. As you get used to not playing the algorithm game and
Mhm.
worrying a little bit less and more authentic, um, have you found that that anxiety about posting and doing some of that has diminished and you're able to just kind of do the authentic thing? Or is like there's some, I guess my question is, how do you navigate if what you're posting is useful or not, because I can't turn off that part of my brain that is psychology and research based. And so I can say logically, I don't care about the algorithm, but when I have all this data to look at, it's really tempting to still dig into some of that stuff.
I think it's hard because I haven't seen like a ton of success with social media, so I've kind of gotten to the point where it's like, I don't know, I spent a year putting in a lot of time and energy, and I grew to like 2,000 followers, which is something, but it's not significant enough to really make like an impact for me. And so I was kind of like, maybe this just isn't the place that I am going to thrive. That's been something I've been trying to learn in my like last few years of life is pick a path and walk down it. And if you do well, you do well. And like you can find ways to do well. And if it's really important for you, you can find ways to do well. But because it's not super important for me, then I'm just like not putting all of my effort into it. And I'm just basically there to maintain a presence and hopefully provide people some information that is helpful for them. I have a YouTube channel too that I haven't posted to in forever, but I still have people call occasionally and they're like, "Oh, I learned about brain spotting and your videos were so helpful." And like moments like that come in and I'm like, "Well, maybe I could do even more."
Yeah.
And then I'm like, "No, you picked a lane and right now this is the lane that you're in. Like you have to focus on this lane primarily."
Yeah. I think I want to highlight and reiterate some of what you're saying, that like to translate social media success to getting clients in the door is not a direct translation. I
Mhm.
haven't spoken to a single therapist who says social media is the thing that gets me my clients.
Mhm.
And obviously there are huge accounts with large followings, but just to set that expectation, especially for young therapists, that like Instagram, Facebook ads, Google ads, like that's not how you're going to get a majority of your clients, even if it is good to have a presence there. I've translated my approach to my online presence as if a client finds me and they want to see what I'm like before they work with me, it's very out there,
Mhm.
which I think is important. And that's how I picked a therapist. That Psychology Today profile pic doesn't tell me quite enough to know if I want to work with someone or not. I want to hear how they talk. I want to see them talk on a subject. So I think that's good. And it is a time commitment
Mhm.
editing TikTok. Like TikTok is, I'm too old for it. I've decided, and it's just too foreign to me. But like Reels and all that stuff, I have a YouTube channel as well. Like it is time consuming to have that much content, and that the algorithm really appreciates consistency. So
Mhm.
posting regularly. It's so weird because we can talk about these topics for hours, but to pull content out of a hat is really hard. Like, I think as therapists, we're used to providing structure, holding space, and our clients bring the content. And so it is weird then to like, I could talk about couples, I could talk about ADHD, I could talk about all these things that I have specialties in, but like, it's almost harder to pick a topic or have content just because we know so much.
Yeah, and the idea of it being so nuanced too really makes it challenging to put something together that's going to be meaningful and impactful for people that isn't too much information but isn't too little information. Like, there's just so much that then goes into it that I think can cause some of that overwhelm and make it really hard, especially when you're talking about something like Instagram or TikTok or even Facebook where it's fast and under a minute. It's like, man, I don't really know what I can put out there that I want to make sure isn't also harmful to some effect.
Yeah. I remember the first time I tried to do like I think the limit on a TikTok at the time was like 90 seconds, and I could not get it under 90 seconds and be like, well, no, like I can't post this then because there's not enough information. I need the qualifications.
Mhm.
I need the asterisks to like this simple communication technique I'm giving people. So it really does limit what we're able to present to people. And again, we'll get into this in a future episode, but like then unaliving people instead of talking about suicide directly, talking about some of the things that get edited. You have to say segs instead of sex. And like
Yeah.
that goes against what the research shows as being the best way to prevent harm and reduce harm. So I think there's just so much in it. We could talk about who owns it. And yeah, there's a lot of issues. I think it is great and wonderful for community building and also should not cannot be the only source of information that we have for people.
And can't be people's primary source of community. I think we kind of
Mhm.
forget that too, is like it is a great community builder, but when we talk about community, even talking about therapists getting clients, like a part of the reason you get clients, a part of the reason you get known is because you're in your community and people know like your values and what your clinic represents and all of that stuff. And that is so powerful and so easy to forget when it's so easy for us to like join a Facebook group and kind of feel close to people or like at least
Yeah.
get answers, that then we stop seeking real life community that is so much more impactful for our nervous systems and our well-being and our joy in life. Like it just makes such a difference.
Yeah, for sure. I think, yeah, it is. Social media is great for community access, community building. But
Yeah.
yes, having that mix, and I think it's different for different people, but that
Yeah.
mix of online and in real life is really important still. Um, I'm going to left turn a little bit here. How, as a business owner, as somebody who carries a caseload yourself, creating content for social media and stuff, how do you balance all of that? What does it look like for you to sort of take care of yourself while
Mm.
having all these different plates spinning at the same time?
Yeah, I think I had a daughter, she'll be 2 in November. And things really changed once I had her. Prior to that, I could do a lot more, mostly because I was able to work until like 6 o'clock at night every night, and that's just not willing something I'm willing to sacrifice with my time with her, especially when she's so young right now. And so I'm really glad that I had the time that I had to do all of what I needed to do to get to a place where I can coast a little. And if anybody who knows me listens to this, they'll laugh because my husband says I'm the worst coaster ever. Like, I'll coast for like a couple of months and then I just get a little bit antsy and I'm like, but all these ideas, I have all these ideas of all these things I could do. And it turns out every single one of them takes a lot of time. So I've really worked hard since I had her on cutting back my caseload. Before I had at least a few employees and I was still seeing like 25 people a week, and it was just a little bit too much with the business and everything. So now I try to be really cognizant of when I take on new clients. I used to feel really obligated to take on anybody who wanted to see me or that I felt really compassionate towards. And I've realized through my own work and reflection that sometimes compassion is saying no. Like if I take somebody on and then I just can't hold the space for them, or holding the space for them comes at the sacrifice of being able to hold space for my family, it's just too high. And so sometimes the most compassionate thing I can do is say no and delegate and pass something on.
Hmm.
So smaller caseload, managing if I take on new intakes and what that kind of looks like. And then my like greatest act of self-care, I swear, is delegation, because I'm terrible at it and it goes against every fiber in my being and everything I've learned growing up, which was like you just do it all yourself and then you die. Um, and I decided that that is not how I wanted to live life as I
Hmm.
grew, and have really worked hard on asking for help. Even my mom says, she's like, "Oh, you're so much better asking for help than I ever was." And I'm like, I am so aware of that. And it's been something I've had to work really hard on because we grow up in a society, I think, that is very individualized and really places value on like, wow, you run this business and you do all this stuff. Like, it's so great. And I'm the first person to say, like, yes, I have built a lot of that. And it is because I have people that are willing to stand beside me. And I go, you got to take this. They go, perfect. I got it. I can put it on my to-do list. And so that's been my greatest act of self-care. And it's still something I'm always working at, is learning how to delegate. Um, and then, finding that balance in my personal life, especially with motherhood. I think there's a lot of guilt around parents of like needing to spend all of your time with your kids, and needing to make sure, especially as a therapist, when you know about like attachment theory and stuff like that, man, it like really gets in your head. And so finding ways to take time apart to make sure that I'm focused on taking care of myself, and then prioritizing my self-care has been really important too. Like one of my top things is working out, and so I really try to exercise 3 to 4 times a week, whether that be a full hour or if I can only get 30 minutes, like that's a top priority for me. And then having space to meditate throughout my week for very short periods of time is also a top priority for me. And as long as I'm hitting those, typically I'm in a relatively good space. And then, I mean, the last thing that I do is just notice when I'm not and see what I need to shift because we all have tendencies to move back into habits, I think, that
Yeah.
were near and dear to us at one time and helped us survive. And so noticing when those are coming up, and I have some wonderful people around me that kind of go like, "Oh, you've been a little bit more like this lately, and I just wonder if there's anything else going on that you need to kind of figure out a way to move out or you're doing too much." And because I have that core group of people who, I really trust to give me that information, I take it and I really reflect on it and try to look at what is going on in my life. And I think that all of that has been super helpful for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think delegating and asking for help are kind of two sides of the same coin. And I
Mhm.
find I love delegating. It feels really great. And I have always been bad at asking for help. And there's some difference in my brain that seems significant between those things. Um, but when I was working in higher ed, like delegating seemed really like values aligned and really easy. I coached a team. Like it made so much sense. But I think in therapy, we don't really have that structure. It is kind of this almost bleeding heart concept where we're not
Mhm.
just raised in, but then educated within that, like you take on everybody who walks through the door and like, oh, there aren't resources in your community. Well, then like you're going to fill that gap. And like,
Yep.
what is this client supposed to do? They're not going to solve it. So you have to help them. So it's like, there is this idea of, I don't know. As you were talking, I was like, yeah, the structure within therapy doesn't exist for delegation. Like that's
Mhm.
so almost foreign to what we're taught as therapists.
I think that is like now that you say that, I think that's part of the reason I don't get burnt out in therapy as much as I used to because I do delegate a lot of responsibility back to the client now. I think
Mm.
initially and I think a lot of us go into the field because, we're like gonna heal the world and bring world peace and like make sure everybody feels okay. And what you learn in the process of helping people is that a part of empowerment comes from people doing things themselves with support and with guidance. But that's part of the reason I named my business Empowerment Within, because as I shifted and grew, I was like, I don't want to be the person who is having to hold your hand through every single thing. How disempowering does that feel that you need somebody there constantly and can't trust yourself? And
Yeah.
so a lot of our work here focuses on like, how do we help you heal what you need to heal and build up, not so that you have to do it all on your own, but so that you can do pieces that you couldn't do before on your own and you can trust your own guidance when you need more and what more really means for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've been in the field for 15 years. I've always said my goal in therapy is to make myself not needed. Like that's been in my informed consent, my little spiel that I give when I
Uh,
first meet clients for over a decade. But when I reflect on my career, how I, as a therapist, implement that has changed a lot
Yeah,
as I've gotten the experience. So I think I always knew that, but how to actually do it looks a lot different now at this point in my career than it did when I started.
I did not always know that. I fully started off like, and I think it comes from like my own places of needing healing, of like wanting people to take care of me. And so I'm going to be the person to take care of people. And that's been such a beautiful thing to unburden in my life because now I'm just like, I am going to take care of myself. I'm going to support you as much as I can, to the point of like, part of my goal is to help you lift up and be able to move forward without me forever.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, this is an expansive topic, and I know we're going to wrap up soon, so I don't want to go too deep. But since you brought up being a parent now and navigating a lot of that, I think as providers, our human experience impacts our work too. I look at how I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I've done couples counseling since before I was married. I've done a lot of stuff with parenting and co-parenting since before I had kids. But like those life transitions that we go through in our own personal lives impact a lot of how we work and some reflection points on how we're showing up with our clients.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, I
so
mean, I
I
think
find, yeah, go ahead.
I just think since becoming a mom, my understanding of my moms is like tenfold. And I think it's the most amazing thing for me about getting to be a therapist and sitting across from clients is I tell everybody I'm not going to talk a talk that I'm unwilling to walk. And so when I hear something come out of my mouth that I'm like, you better look in the mirror today. It's
Yeah.
like it's an awesome self-reflection point of just like, yeah, I'm giving this very genuinely to people. I need to also make sure that I'm taking in what I'm saying outwardly.
Yeah. And I love, as we were talking about the importance of community and delegating and asking for help, like I have a 6 and a 3-year-old. So these are concepts of supporting autonomy and then teaching how to ask for help when needed is like, that's a big thing for a 3-year-old right now. And so it's just like, yeah, there's this almost reparenting you go through while you're parenting your kids of like, oh, that's not how my parents did it. This is how I'm showing up for my kid. And then like this kind of aha light bulb moment of like, yeah, like you're saying, look in the mirror today.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I think that that's been a really cool part and a really, really challenging part of parenting my daughter has been um, having the opportunity because she is very similar to me, which is really challenging. And I have a lot of empathy for some of the people in my life sometimes because she can be very spicy and very emotional and has really big opinions and is absolutely sure of them. And so it's been very cool to get to support her and love her compassionately, even in setting boundaries through that and getting to recognize like how I've needed that in my life in that specific way too. Um,
Mhm.
and I know none of us get out of parenting like scot free. I mean, there's always stuff that's going to happen that you're like, all right, that probably wasn't my best moment. But I think getting to parent after you've done a lot of your work, and I can tell like you've really moved through a lot too, is that you also get to then be open to being wrong with your kids.
Mhm.
And that's such a reparative and restorative thing for your kids to get to say, like, no, you didn't get it right, or this hurt me, and have a parent actually show up in that.
Yeah. Yeah. This is fun work that we do.
Yeah.
Um, it's challenging and it's a lot sometimes, but uh, Patrice, if people want to work with you, oh, let's talk about your workshop that's coming up.
Yeah.
Promote. Let's do the plug your pluggables here.
Yeah, October 5th, 2024, for anybody listening in the future, we're doing a couples workshop. It's labeled Finding Us Again. And basically, what my colleague and I, Serena, really want to do is kind of create a jump start to connection for people. Couples therapy is amazing, and it takes time to build some of those foundational blocks. And so, our hope is really that this workshop is going to help enhance emotional intimacy relatively quickly and understanding so that you can kind of take those tools and either decide, you want to continue on with couples therapy to deepen that, or really it should give you the solid tools and foundation to move forward and stay in connection with your partner more. I think a lot of couples counseling sometimes focuses on mediation, and there's a time and a place for that. But this workshop is really about enhancing self understanding and then understanding of your partner to have that be the connection point and actually the resolve of the problem rather than the problem being the focus point itself. So it's 4 hours from 9 to 1 on a Saturday so that hopefully people can get childcare if they need it and take the time out. And our hope is that, we're going to teach in the group setting the psychoeducational information and the exercises, but then we're actually going to have everybody break down into their couple to work on the exercises privately together. So I've gotten some concerns of people being like, I don't want to talk about my issue in front of everybody. And I'm like, exactly, don't do that. Because we're talking about individuals being individuals, and then you got two individuals in a couple. Like, you just can't really compare and contrast relationships like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. And if people want to find out more information about the workshop, sign up, or they want to find out more about your work or connect with you, where do they go? How do they get that information?
Yeah, anybody can visit us at our website is empowermentwithinllc.com. We're on Facebook as Empowerment Within LLC. Instagram is empowerment.within. And then so is my TikTok. So follow us
Yeah.
on social media and visit our website.
Yes, and we will have show notes with all those links so that they're easy to
Beautiful.
find here. Patrice, thanks so much for coming on and sharing all this wonderful wisdom with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeremy.
And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in again. We're back from our little hiatus, so we'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.